Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for our presentation today all around safeguarding your business. My name is Nancy Lavery, and I'll be doing part of the presentation along with my brother, Robert Lavery. So, when we talk about safeguarding your business, the pandemic has forced changes in the way that we work, and transaction processes have gone virtual to adapt to fewer people being in the office and the need for paperless flows of information that can be accessed easily while maintaining security and privacy of this information. So, in this session, we want to talk about some key software tools that are going to help with compliance and illustrate how you can support your remote workers and safeguard your data in cost-effective ways. So the products that we want to talk about today are all around this concept of safeguarding your business and your data. So we're going to have a look at a few different products. One of them is called SOX Second Sight, that's going to help you with forcing a segregation of duties within Sage 300. And then we're going to talk about SOX Check Approval, where we can put approval processes around your AP payments. We're going to show Document Management Link along with these products. And then we're going to wrap up with Rob, who's going to show you the EFT product and talk to you about some additional privacy legislation. So the first product I want to have a look at today is the SOX Second Sight. So SOX Second Sight is going to give you the ability to force a segregation of duties. So, a lot of businesses, can get around this by just using the security within Sage 300 and just granting users certain access to be able to do certain functions within Sage 300. But there may be cases where you have a group of employees that are all doing the same job. So you need to be able to grant them the access in Sage 300, but you still want to safeguard your data. So with SOX Second Sight, you can give users access within Sage 300, but you can force a segregation of duties around the creation and posting of your batches. So you can see that it will install within the menu of modules. It's a very simple product to just install and activate within Sage 300, and you just have this one icon to set the product up. So you can force the segregation of duties around your batches in accounts payable. So that's your invoice, your payment and adjustment batches. You can also do this around your general ledger journal entries at both the batch level and the journal entry level. And today we're going to have a look around accounts receivable. So as far as setting up the product, you literally just install and activate it through administrative services. And then you will activate the tick box for the batches that you want to force the segregation of duties against and click the install button. As far as the entries that you're doing in Sage 300, nothing is going to change about those. And in fact, users won't even really know SOX Second Sight is running unless they try to both participate in a batch and post the same batch. So that's where we're doing the segregation of duties. When someone goes to try and post a batch, SOX Second Sight is going to review the entries in that batch, and if that person participated in any of the entries, they cannot be the person that posts the batch. So we've got it set up around accounts receivable. So if we come up to accounts receivable entry, and we go into the invoice batch entry, we'll see I created this batch that I've just named Safeguarding Your Business for today's presentation, where I just have one entry in it. So I'm currently logged in as the administrative user. If I go to try and set this batch to post, a message is going to pop up to say you cannot set batch 71 to ready to post because you have made changes or entries within this batch. Another user needs to review this batch and set it to ready to post. So I could then log in as any other user. In fact, let's log in as the general manager, for example. And when we go to that invoice batch list, for that same batch, I can now set this to ready to post and post that batch. So you see that it's allowing a different user to post the batch. So it's a nice handy little tool if you have groups of employees that are doing the same job that you need to be able to grant the access in Sage 300. But you want to still have two sets of eyes on each of those batches. So that's the SOX Second Sight product. The next product that I wanted to cover with you today is SOX Check Approval. So with the SOX Check Approval, we're forcing an approval process around your AP payments. And again, it's a simple module to install, and there's just this one setup screen. And what we're doing here is when we get to the payment entry, you'll see, again, it's the same screen that users are familiar with. It's just got a check in the background that is going to force someone to submit a payment batch for approval. So the connection string that we have at the top of this screen is connecting to a SQL instance, and that's going to be the approval database. So you just create an instance in SQL, and then you literally would come to this database tab and hit the create button, and that creates the tables in the approval console that we will have a look at as we go through the presentation today. The good news about that approval console is it is outside of Sage 300. So users that are going to be doing approvals for the payments do not have to log into Sage 300. They can access that approval console from their start menu. And in fact, it could be run on something like an iPad with the correct infrastructure. And then you can have up to 3 levels of approval. So I've got mine set to 3 levels right now. And at each level of approval, you'll see the users that you have set up in your environment. And with a tick box activation, that will signify who's responsible for doing the approval at each of the levels. So you'll see I have my general manager at level 1, my controller at level 2, and my CEO at level 3. So you can do 1, 2, or 3 levels of approval. You can set it so that all payments go to all levels for approval. So someone submits a payment batch for approval, everything will go to level 1, then to level 2, then to level 3. What we're going to have a look at in today's case is where I'm setting approval limits. So my level 1 approver can approve up to $2,000. My level 2 approver can approve up to $5,000. And if it exceeds that, it's going to go to the CEO for approval. Now, in this case, the way this workflow works, we're going to create some payments today, and we're going to create some that are less than $2,000. So anything that's less than $2,000 will go to the general manager for approval. Anything within that payment batch that exceeds $2,000 but is less than $5,000 will go to the controller for approval. So that's what we're going to do today. But if I also included a payment in that batch that exceeded $5,000, then that would go to the CEO. So you can set any dollar value threshold, and the lower amounts will go to one user, the higher amounts will go to another user. But you could also have another option for a workflow where everything goes to level 1, and then only those over 2,000 would go to level 2. And then anything over 5,000 would go to level 3. So some different options you have in terms of how you want to be getting those payments approved. Now, a few other options. You can send things into the approval console. Everything sent in is approved, and the user that's reviewing it will just uncheck those that they don't want to approve. Or you can send everything in as unapproved and force the user to activate a tick box to signify that they've reviewed it and they're okay to approve it. But what we're going to do in our case today is I've set it so that anything under $500 will go in as approved, and anything above that is what I want my users to review and approve. So some flexibility that you have there. Now, we're also going to see that anything that I do not approve is going to create a new batch for me. So that's another option that you have. So, we don't want to hold up an entire payment batch if there's one or two payments that you don't want to approve. So we allow you to not approve payments within the batch. And in this case, I've activated the feature where anything that I don't approve is going to create a new batch for me. And we're also going to see document management link integrated with the SOX Check Approval. So this gives me the ability to store backup documentation to view throughout the process. Okay. And there is also email notification capability. So we can send emails throughout the approval process to each of your approvers. And then we can email the person that initially submitted that batch for approval to let them know that the payments have been approved and they can go ahead and process that payment batch. So when we come up to accounts payable, what I've done is I've created an invoice batch list. I wanted to start at posting of the invoice batch just to show you that it's the same steps that you would be familiar with today. We're not changing your process in any way. All we're doing is adding in the approval process and the control around that. So I created a batch today that I just called Safeguarding Your Business. So this is my batch of invoices. And the first thing you'll notice is this additional window beside the Sage screen. So that is the document management link solution where you can store documents and view those throughout Sage 300. So with document management link, we're linking documents to a field on the screen. So in this first window, what we're seeing is documents that I have stored around my vendor number. So I can see all of these documents. They're linked to the vendor number field. And based on the value in that field, in this case, my vendor 1200, I'm able to see the documents I have stored for that particular vendor. If that value changed to 1400, then I would start to see the documents related to my vendor 1400. So the window will dynamically change as you move through screens. Now, what I've done in the second window is we've got a configuration where around two fields. So I'm looking at the vendor number folder, but I want to filter what I'm seeing in this window based on the document number. So that would be around the invoice this invoice entry for this particular invoice number. So how I go about adding a document, when I hover over the document management link window, I can just click this add button and go out anywhere into my environment to find the document that I want to link to this invoice entry. So I can just search anywhere in my environment, click on a document, drag it and drop it in the document management link window. And you'll notice that it renamed the document. So that's an optional configuration where I specified when I drag a document into this window, I want to rename that document based on the document number that's in the document number field. So that's how it knew how to rename my document for me. And it's refiled that document into my vendor number folder. I can get to the folders by clicking on the button at the top of the window. By clicking that button, I can see all of the fields that are currently configured around this screen, and I can go straight to the vendor number folder to view the documents there. So I'm showing an example where I'm storing documents in network folders. You could also store documents in OneDrive or Google Docs or Dropbox or even SharePoint if you're running Microsoft SharePoint. The idea of this product is linking a document to the Sage screen. So I'm going to go ahead and link documents to all of our invoices here. So I'll just quickly drag these in, and then we'll have a look at the value for these. And now you can see here, this vendor number 1350 actually doesn't have any documents. So what document management link will do in that case is not only does it link and file the document, but in this case, it's going to create the folder for my vendor 1350 since I don't have one yet. So, once you get the file structure in place, document management link will dynamically build on that folder structure for you. And then we'll go to our last entry here and add a document. And it's important to add these here because I want to show you that by linking them here on the AP invoice screen, when we open up the payment entry screen and the SOX Check Approval console, we'll be able to see those documents. So with Document Management Link, you can link documents once and view those documents against multiple screens in Sage 300. So when we look at the entries that we have and the payments that we're going to create for these, you'll notice what I've done here is I've got one invoice that is under $500. So we're going to expect that to go into the approval console for the general manager as approved. And then I have a payment here that's under $2,000. So that's also going to go to the general manager, and that should go in as unapproved. And then we have a payment that exceeds $2,000. So that's going to go to our controller, and then another one that exceeds $2,000 that will go to our controller, but we'll decline that so you can see what will happen within the payment batch when we decline an entry. So I'm just going to go ahead and post this invoice batch. And then we're going to come over to the payment entry screen. So again, I just wanted to illustrate that, we're not changing anything about the process that you're currently doing. So we're just going to add a new batch here. And we'll go ahead and start creating payments. So we had an invoice. Okay, so it's going to do a currency conversion here for us. So hopefully our amounts are still going to be okay. So we'll go ahead and say yes to our initial invoice for $324, and we'll add that. And again, you'll notice there's the document that we attached, and there's our vendor documents being displayed against the payment entry screen. So let's add that one. That was our under 500. And then we had one for our vendor 1400. So there it is there for 1130. So let's add a payment for that one. And then we had one for our vendor 1350. And that one is here. So let's go ahead and add that. And lastly, I think it was 1200 again. Well, let's just do this one for 5,000. Good enough. So you see that I've created the payments, and there was nothing different about that. Sorry, I shouldn't have gone out of that screen. So let's go back in there. So, so I've created all of those payments. So now if I want to, maybe we'll go to the batch screen. Let's go to the batch screen. So there's our batch here for our 4 payments that we've entered. And you'll notice what's different about this screen is the submit for approval button. So that's how users are going to submit this batch for approval. If I try to set this to ready to post, then I'm going to get a message that says it has not been submitted for approval. So you cannot set the batch to ready to post, which means you can't print checks or post the batch until the approval has taken place. So we'll go ahead and submit this for approval. So our batch number 60, and this is me saying, notify me when this batch gets approved, and put in my email address so that it will go ahead and send me an email when that batch changes to an approved status. So that's the email notifications working. So we'll just say okay to that. And you'll notice that the batch then has been submitted for approval, and the button will show that that's now in progress. So anyone coming into this screen will see that that approval process is in progress. So now the approval console, as I mentioned, it sits outside of Sage 300 in your Start menu. And we're going to log in first as our general manager. And you'll see, so Tyrox is my company name. If I am running multiple companies in Sage 300, you can filter multiple companies into the same approval console. So if you have a user that's responsible for doing approvals across multiple companies, you can filter those all into the same approval console, and you'll see a tree view with the company name and then any batches within that company. But you don't have to do it that way. If you have different people responsible for different companies, then you would just filter those into the appropriate approval consoles. But here's our batch for safeguarding our business. And as expected, we're seeing 2 different payments showing up. So we've got our one that was under $500 has come in as approved. So, you know, the users don't need to necessarily review those payments that fall under that threshold that you've set. So it's still going to appear in their approval console, but in this case, it's come in as already approved. And then we have the other payment in that batch that was less than $2,000, so what we expected. Now, you'll notice down here is the document, so I can click on that to view the backup documentation. And I can see the company that it's drawn against, the description of the batch, the branch, the bank that it's drawn against. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll activate this and we'll approve both of those payments. I'll save my work and approve it. In a multi-level approval process, you can return. So I could return this, if I'm the second approver, I could return it to the first approver, or I could return it all the way back to the person that initially submitted it for approval if I want changes to be made to this batch. But I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, I'm approving that. So it's been approved by the GM, but now we know we have more payments within that batch. So we'll go ahead and we'll sign in now as the controller. For our safeguarding our business, and there's a payment. Now, I know that I chose an invoice that actually exceeded the $2,000, so that's why we're only seeing, exceeded $5,000, so that's why we're only seeing one payment here for the controller. So we'll go ahead and we're going to approve that one. We'll save that and approve it. And that means then that the one that exceeded the $5,000 limit for the controller has actually gone to the CEO. So we'll log in here as the CEO to do the approval for the invoice that exceeded the controller's approval limit. So there's the one that far exceeded. So we'll go ahead. Actually, you know what? We'll decline this one. Oh, you know what? I don't know if I can decline just one. So we'll go ahead and approve that. Okay, so now when we go back into Sage 300, you'll see that this batch dynamically updated. So you don't have to run a process. It's going to dynamically update this batch as soon as all of the approvals have taken place. So now I can go ahead and print the checks and post this batch. So that's how the SOX Check Approval product works. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Rob, and he's going to talk to you about how you can then go about electronically sending these payments to your vendors in this case. and a little bit about some privacy legislation.
Thanks very much, Nancy. That was a great overview of some nice software tools that will help organizations, both for-profit and not-for-profit, to safeguard their assets within the organization by being able to use SOX Second Sight and the SOX Check Approval. What we'd like to do now is step back from the software for just a moment to talk about the new legislation that came out a few years ago, affectionately known as PAITA, which stands for Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. This legislation includes 10 fair information principles for organizations that are conducting what they call commercial activities, which for most organizations are purchasing information or inventory items from vendors, or selling goods to customers, or in the case of charitable organizations, collecting donations and allocating those funds to projects. And so a wide breadth of organizations are covered under this legislation. And the key concept is what they call a breach of security safeguards, which includes the loss of unauthorized access to or unauthorized disclosure of personal information. And that can include employees' information, it can include donors' information as a charitable organization, or information from your vendors that you're using to make electronic payments to. And so when Nancy talked about the SOX Second Sight, PAITA requires organizations to have in place physical, organizational, and technical security safeguards that are appropriate to the sensitivity of the information that you're working with within SAGE 300 to avoid what they define as significant harm. So by having another person review other people's work before it can be posted, you're putting what we would call a technical security safeguard within SAGE 300 to avoid significant harm by people making errors in the transactions that they're posting, or avoiding the misuse of information. The other thing that Nancy showed through the TIROC SOX Check Approval was workflow approvals around payments. And so what we want to do is ensure that payments are being approved at the appropriate level based on the criteria that you specify to avoid that significant harm. So that might be dollar value thresholds, as Nancy showed, or it could be based on the nature of the transaction itself or the type of vendor that you're making payments to. Now, if a breach occurs, you have to report these breaches to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And for folks in the US, there's a separate reporting body that you have to comply with. And those reporting requirements include the steps that you've taken as an organization to mitigate the breach and avoid future breaches. So again, what Nancy talked about was how you can document within SAGE 300 through the configuration options you choose for both TIROC SOX Check Approval and SOX Second Sight, that you have assigned certain rights to individuals to safeguard the information or put controls in place, whether it's a review of the information or an actual workflow approval, to make sure that information is properly processed within SAGE 300. So to now move over to the electronic funds transfer solution, I want to parlay off what Nancy talked about as we now transition from producing paper-based checks, which is what Nancy showed when she posted and printed the payment batch to generate the checks. What we want to do with EFT is we want to highlight the fact that it's no longer necessary to produce paper-based checks. One of the other things that the pandemic has created is this need to not have everyone have to come into the office in order to process payments by printing paper checks and having people physically sign, or if you've digitized the signatures, to produce those payments and then have someone stuff and fold the paper checks into envelopes and get them out into the mail. That is an inefficient process at best. It's more costly in the sense that you have to buy pre-printed check stock. You're using laser printers with laser ink. You're also having to have the cost of paper envelopes and the labor to fold and stuff those checks into the envelopes, and then the postage cost to put them in the mail. When we introduce EFT processing, or ACH, within Sage 300, we still need a payment batch, but now we're creating an EFT file which has the vendor's bank details in it, so that all you need to do is upload that file to your bank website, and then they will process payment electronically to your vendors. Now, when we talk about generating those AP payment batches, you have an option to choose one payment batch to create your EFT file, or a range of payment batches. If you choose a range, that would be useful if your bank is charging per file upload versus per transaction. If they're charging per transaction, then it doesn't matter how many files you upload. So in that case, some organizations will want one EFT file per one payment batch. But what's important from a control standpoint and complying with the Information Protection Act is that the system also allows you to select between posted and unposted batches. Best practices would suggest you say no to that option, because as you're probably aware, if you make a change to an unposted batch within Sage 300, there's no record of that change unless you're using some sort of additional audit logging tool in the Sage 300 database. So typically we would say no to that. Now, when you combine this option with the use of the SOX Check Approval, you have a tremendous control in place, because SOX Check Approval doesn't allow you to post the payment batch until someone has reviewed and approved those payments. So by saying you only allow posted batches as the basis for creating EFT files, you know by definition that if it's posted, it's been approved. So therefore, only approved payments can be included within the EFT file transmission to the bank. Now, there are other options here, like whether you want to combine vendors together in the payment batch, or whether you want to separate them. Again, best practices would suggest that we want to separate those vendors and display an error if you find a check vendor within an EFT vendor file. And the way that we typically like to control that is through the payment code that you specify here in the processing page of the vendor master file. So if you set up EFT as a payment code, then when it comes to creating payment batches, if you use this function, one of the criteria that you can specify is the payment code. So by using the payment code EFT, you're ensuring that only EFT vendors are part of that payment batch. And then likewise, some of our clients have chosen to create separate series of document numbers for their check versus their EFT vendors. So it is possible to define an EFT check number series versus a standard paper-based or laser check by defining different check forms that can have different check numbers assigned to them. So that also is another way to create a nice, clean audit trail and ensure that checks are being properly processed within the system. But coming back to the options here, when we're setting up the banks, this is a very important aspect of the system, because we take the standard common services bank information that you've already set up for your bank account, and we assign an EFT file type. And the EFT file type can be standard check payments, or it can be Interac email payments, EDI payments, it can be wire payments. We can even support PayPal and Positive Pay, which is where we're still producing checks, but we generate a file to send to the bank to verify the checks that we've produced. There's also internet banking. Depending on the bank or financial institution that you're using, there will be different services with different file types. So we always tell our clients that you need to get what's called the specification from your bank in order for us to identify a compatible file type that we've built into EFT. If there is no EFT file, then we generate additional files at no charge, as long as you're running a current version of Sage 300, which is typically the most current release and the last 2 releases. So once we have the bank information set up, we're in a position to be able to upload those files. Recently, what we've added is the ability to transfer the file through what we call SFTP, which stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol. Because when we set up these files, if we use a two-step process, we need a file path for where that file is stored prior to transmission to the bank. And to secure that file, you can create a secure drive for the Sage 300 database. You can also use domain security through Windows Active Directory services and create data folders that are restricted access. But for some clients, if the bank supports it, an even better option is to create a link through SFTP so that when I generate the EFT file, I don't need to store it in a folder on the network. I can upload it directly to the bank. So if your bank can provide the host name for their server and a user ID and password to authenticate the user, then you can automatically upload the EFT file. The other option is with a key file, which is a token. Some people describe that as a security token. The key file just has an encrypted and a long series of characters, numbers, and letters that the bank uses to authenticate the user and allow access directly to their server. So in all of these cases, you're dealing with sensitive information, but you can secure the process through SFTP or even FTP. And you can create a segregation of duties when you set up the file transfer so that somebody who creates the EFT file is not the same person who uploads it to the bank. So depending on your process and how you want to conduct it, you can either choose the one-step process or the two-step process. But now when we come to the vendors, this is where, again, we have the issues of the Privacy and Protection of Information Act. We take the information from your AP vendor master files and we add their bank account details for their branch, financial institution number, and their account number. And in order for you to be able to send payments to these vendors, they must have a status of active. But if you wish, you can enter these vendors and default the status to entered. And this is a section of the options that you can configure. So if the default vendor status is entered, then when you set up the vendor the first time, it would default the status to entered, and then someone can come in and create the active status. So in a sense, we're creating a review and approval of the vendors that you want to start paying electronically. And in order to ensure that there's a proper segregation of duties there, because EFT is written in the software development kit for Sage 300, it utilizes the same security groups within administrative services as all the other modules within Sage 300. So your accounts payable, accounts receivable, and so on. And what you can do here is you can allow somebody to set up the vendor and then someone else to approve that vendor detail. And that effectively creates the segregation of duties. And this is documented because it's part of Sage 300, so you can verify if a breach occurred, what security measures you had taken to ensure the security around that vendor's sensitive bank account details. Now, the other options to protect that data is to encrypt it. So with the vendor encryption, when you generate a remittance advice for the vendor to identify the payment details, the information from their bank can be encrypted so that you'll only see X's or other characters that you've chosen to safeguard the information that's sensitive. And that means even the person who is receiving the remittance advice would only see an X'd out account number and financial institution number. While we're here, we might as well take a look at the remittance advice. These are standard crystal forms, so you can customize the format and the layout as you wish. But as an example, you'll see the vendor's bank information if you want to include it, their information, who you are as the person making the payment, and then the invoice details with the invoice dates and the amounts that you're paying. But of course, if we're making payments electronically, then we probably want to send the information via email electronically as well. So in this case, we do have the option to create email settings that allow you to send these remittance advices in bulk by linking directly to the email server and an outbound port that will support bulk email transfers. And there are security measures that you can put in place to ensure that authentication is verifying the fact that emails are going out, and you might limit that to a particular individual within the organization as well. And when you send these remittances, you can add a password so that once you send the email to the vendor, only the person with the remittance advice password will be able to open the attachment that's included with the email. Now, with the email, you can define the email message and the language of the body of the email. And that can also include some variables for things like payment date and the list of documents. So while the remittance advice itself, which is attached to the email, can show the list of documents, you could also include that information, if you like, as part of the information that's in the body of the email. And this would also include things like the vendor contact details. So as you can see, there's a number of ways that we've safeguarded the information by putting controls on who can set up vendors, who approves those vendors, encrypting the vendor's bank details, putting passwords on the remittance advices. But there's also an environmental control that we can create, which is by generating the transfer details report, which is basically an output of what's included within the EFT ACH file. And this verifies the information for which vendors were paid, which bank and account number, and whether the status of the transmission was successful and the dollar amount. This also includes the date that the file was created and the user within Sage who created it. And as an environmental control, more of a physical control outside the system, you can compare the transfer details report with the AP payment posting journal and the report that you get back from your bank. And if there's a three-way match between those documents, then you can be assured that what was approved as a payment within accounts payable was generated as part of the EFT file, and that's what the bank had processed. Now, of course, these EFT files themselves have hash totals and control totals, so it's very unlikely that anything that is transmitted to the bank would be modified in any way, because the banks have security routines in their process that are looking to ensure compatibility of the file that you're sending, which is why that specification document I talked about at the beginning is so important. We have to ensure that these files are compatible with the bank system in order for the bank to process them. And then finally, when we look at the transaction details, we have the EFT file itself, and if you wish, you can choose to select individual entries. And when you do that, you can flag these as being paid so that there's no risk of the payment being made twice. And in some ways, it's a very efficient way to generate these payments because you can also post-date the payment transactions within a file. So if your bank supports transaction date as a payment date, then it's possible to upload the file on a Thursday, but not make payment until the Friday or the following Monday or Tuesday. And you could even have different payment dates within that EFT file as necessary. So by no means are we restricting the payment process when you incorporate EFT. You have all of the same flexibility that you would have normally, but now you have the controls around the payment that you can incorporate with EFT, and you've reduced the risk of fraud and identity theft by sending payments electronically rather than paper-based checks through the mail. The last thing I want to highlight is the audit trails. We've talked about the fact that we can generate reports of what's been remitted, but we also have an audit log every time we create an EFT file, and we assign a unique EFT creation number. So in terms of documenting and being able to report on your processes around electronic payments, This is one way you can do it. And by double clicking on the line, it opens up the details of the payments included within that EFT file. And there's a date and a timestamp and the batch number, the person within Sage who created it, where the file was stored if you're storing it on a network folder, and the dollar value of the transactions within that EFT file. We also keep a log of the vendors. So I talked about the fact that you can segregate duties for EFT vendor configuration so that one person enters and another person makes them active. Well, again, we have a date and a timestamp for all the vendor details that are set up within the system, and then you can actually log when the status changed from entered to active. And this is a log that you can keep within the Sage 300 database as long as you wish. So whether it's generating a report or reviewing an audit log, you can rest assured that we're keeping track of the activities within EFT to maintain not only the security of this information, but the integrity and privacy of the information, so that you can comply with any legislative requirements that you have as an organization, but also to give your vendors comfort that you are taking steps to safeguard their personal or private banking details to ensure that it's not going into the wrong hands. So that ends the presentation. We hope that you've enjoyed the content, and we look forward to any follow-up questions or any information that you might need. You can contact us or your local Sage 300 business partner. Thanks very much for your attendance today.